This conference will now be recorded.
In yesterday's session, we were discussing about Terraform and what is Terraform, the advantages of Terraform, the architecture of Terraform, and we started understanding about HashiCorp language basics. As we already discussed, we are going to use something called HCL, a domain-specific language, to define the infrastructure as code in Terraform. HCL is used to describe the desired state of our infrastructure resources. Configurations files which we write in HCL will tell Terraform what plugins to install, what infrastructure resources to create, what data to fetch, like that. HCL is a human readable language. HashiCorp language is a human readable language that is very easy to learn and easy to write. HCL will allow you to describe the desired state of your infrastructure. HCL will allow you to describe the desired state of your infrastructure without specifying the exact steps to achieve that state. So HCL contains blocks. HCL syntax contains blocks that define variety of configurations available to Terraform. As I already told, blocks are like a containers. Blocks are like a containers for some content. You are going to define some content in the form of blocks. And usually those blocks will represent the configuration of some Terraform object like a resource. Blocks will have a block type. And they can have zero or more labels, and followed by double flower brackets that contain a block's body. Within the flower brackets, you are going to define the body of that block. You can define any number of arguments in that body based on the resource type, and you can define nested blocks also. Most of the Terraform features are controlled by top level blocks. Most of the Terraform features are controlled by top level blocks in a configuration file. So this is a general representation of a block. This is general representation of a block type, followed by block labels, 0 or more labels. And within this flower bracket, you are going to define the arguments for that block. We call it as a body. So blocks are composed of key value pairs. This body. Terraform accepts any type of values like strings, numbers, booleans, maps, and list type of values. As I already told, single line comments in Terraform configuration files can start with hash character. Multi-line comments are, we can open multi-line comment with this, and you can close that with this. And if you see an example of resource block, this is block type. Here we have a block type called resource. Since we are using AWS as a provider, you can see more details about this resource type and its arguments. These are like arguments for that block. This is like a name or alias name for this block. This is like a resource type. So as I already told, Terraform has various blocks. Terraform has a various blocks. We will call it as a root, I mean to say top level blocks in the Terraform. So as part of Terraform, we will understand this HCL blocks. As I already told yesterday, we have the Terraform block, provider block, resource block, variable block, locals block, output block, module block, data block, like that. We have various blocks. We will understand the basic structure and purpose of each block first. We will understand the basic structure and the purpose of each block. Once we are familiar with these blocks, we will start building our infrastructure. Now, as I already told, Terraform block is used for setting the version of the Terraform we want. This Terraform block is used for doing some kind of a Terraform settings. Using Terraform block, we can do some settings related to Terraform only. So Terraform block is used for setting the version of the Terraform we want to use, and it may also contain required providers block inside, which will specify the what version of the provider we need, as well as where that provider, from where Terraform has to download that provider. That provider is nothing but a plugin, from where it has to download that provider. So Terraform block, example of the Terraform block is something like this. And again, if we are using Terraform 0.13 or later versions, if you are using 0.13 or later versions of Terraform, this is how you will define the Terraform block. If you have to work with AWS providers, I mean to say, if you have to create and manage or update resources in AWS, you will say required provider like AWS like this. There are various providers, over 1,000 plus providers are there in Terraform registry, developed and maintained by HashiCorp or some community. So based on the platform which you are using to create a resources, you can use appropriate provider. As I already told, this is the Terraform block where you are going to define required providers. Now Terraform knows that it has to download AWS provider. That providers are like a plugins, kind of a APIs in the background. So it knows that Terraform knows that it has to download the AWS provider to manage the resources in AWS cloud like that. You have various providers. Terraform registry. There is Terraform registry where Terraform is maintaining the providers. There are various providers. Terraform registry, this provides the power of all the Terraform resource types. So you have providers, various providers like a plugins. Providers are the logical abstraction of APIs. Providers are nothing but some kind of a APIs in the background. These providers are responsible for understanding the API interactions and exposing the resources. Suppose you want to work with AWS resources. Suppose you want to manage the lifecycle management of AWS resources like EC2, Lambda, EKS, ECS, VPC, S3, RDS, many more. You can use this provider. So this provider is part of Terraform registry. And every provider has a documentation. With respective versions also. This is the latest version. Of AWS provider. You can select appropriate version if you want to use old version of the AWS provider, or you can go with the latest version also. And if you see what is this provider all about also, there is giving a overview. We are in the overview page only. There is a documentation also. So AWS provider will interact with many resources supported by AWS. So this AWS provider will interact with many resources supported by AWS. So you must configure the provider with proper credentials before you try to manage the resources from AWS, right? So how to use, they are saying If you are using Terraform 0.13 and later, you can define something like this. And here, this indicates what version of the provider you want to download it by Terraform. So you are saying some kind of a greater than notation, 4.0, 4.0 and above. So today latest version is 4.55. Suppose there is a one more release happened in the Terraform provider, AWS provider 4.6 also. Suppose you are again initializing this Terraform configurations, it will download the latest version. Suppose if you exactly give like this, suppose if you exactly give like this, instead of giving like this, let's say you have exactly given something like this. You have exactly given like this, right? Something like this, 4.55.0. Always it is going to download that one only, that version of the provider. If you give something like this, always it is going to download that one only. But in future also, if there is any new provider has been introduced, it is not going to download. When you initialize that Terraform directory, it is not going to download the new versions of the provider. Based on your use case, you can stick to the same version, or you can use latest versions also, latest versions of the provider. So is everyone clear what is this Terraform block? If you are using Terraform 0.13 and latest version, this is how you can use provider. Suppose you want to work with Azure. So you are going to define the Terraform block something like this. You are going to work with Azure, you can define something like this. Required providers, Azure. So Terraform knows that you are going to download, you need Azure provider to create Azure resources. You are going to download Azure provider to create Azure resources. Similarly, if you guys are working with the GCP cloud, similarly, if you guys are working with GCP cloud, right, you can use in your Terraform configuration something like this. Something like this. Clear? What is the provider block? Sorry, what is the Terraform block which we are going to use in our Terraform code, Terraform configurations? Is everyone clear? What is this? Now, the way we have a Terraform block, there is something called provider block. The way you have a Terraform block, you have something called provider block. The way you have a Terraform block, there is something called provider block. So Terraform relies on plugins. We already discussed. Terraform relies on plugins called providers. Terraform relies on plugins called providers to interact with cloud providers or any SaaS providers or any other APIs. A provider in a Terraform is nothing but a plugin. A provider in a Terraform is nothing but a plugin that enables interaction with and respect to APIs to create or update or delete the resources. So Terraform configurations must declare which providers they require. Terraform configurations must declare which providers they require so that Terraform can download those providers, those plugins, and it can use to manage the resources. And some providers require additional information, additional configurations like in what region, in which region it has to create resources, manage resources, and some kind of a URLs or paths like that before they can be used. So using provider block, something like this additional information. Here in Terraform block, you are saying you need AWS provider, but using provider block, you are going to configure the provider, what region, in what region it has to manage the resources. And if required, you need to connect with AWS. You need to authenticate with AWS also, right? How it can authenticate, how Terraform can authenticate with AWS by providing some kind of access keys here, by providing some kind of secret keys or role details, something like that. You are going to configure some additional details to the provider that you can use with this provider block. With this provider block, you can say under which region Terraform has to manage the resources, what is the access key or secret key, or what is the role ARN Terraform can use to connect with that provider. So provider related configurations you are going to define under provider block. And again, if you guys are using Terraform 0.13 and later, they introduce Terraform block. In the Terraform block, you are saying I am going to use this provider. Using provider block, you are configuring provider related settings. But if you guys are using still old version of the Terraform, if you guys are using old version of the Terraform like 0.2 and earlier, so there is no Terraform block earlier, older versions. In the provider block itself, you will say what version of the provider you need, under which region, like that. But now, latest versions, you have a Terraform block where you can do some kind of a settings at the Terraform level, and provider block, you can do some configurations about provider. So is everyone clear? And again, the options, the arguments for provider block is going to vary based on the what provider you are using. Suppose you are using Azure provider, there are different options. Let me show that. If you guys are using AWS provider, so in the documentation you can see you are giving provider information, but there are a lot of other details you can give in the provider block, like this: access key, secret key, or your AWS credentials details, what arguments this provider will take, they have given here. So you can pass access key and secret key, or you can give your role ARN, or some other informations to configure that provider. That provider details, provider configurations, you can specify in that provider block. What arguments are allowed for that provider block is again specific to the provider which we are using. AWS provider can take these type of arguments, right? Like role details or access keys and secret keys, something like this. These options in this provider block is based on the provider which you are using. Suppose you guys are working with Azure. So Azure provider block may have a different arguments. You can see Azure provider block, they have different arguments. You can see there are various options, different options for Azure provider. Arguments are specific to the provider. You can see what arguments you can pass for this provider, they have given here. So these are Azure related configuration. Provider related configurations you can define in the provider. Is everyone clear? What do you mean by this provider block? Using provider block, you can configure the respective provider, what provider or what plugin you are using. Those provider related configurations you are going to define in the provider block. If you are using Terraform 0.13 and later, this is how you have a separate provider block along with Terraform block. So this is Terraform block, this is provider block. Suppose you are using Terraform 0.12 and earlier, there is no Terraform block, everything is part of provider block only. Version of the provider and the provider related configurations. Clear? What is this provider block? What is this provider block before we proceed further? Provider blocks is used to configure the provider related settings, kind of access keys, secret keys, region. If you are using Google, the Google project name, under which project you want to manage the resources, like those provider related settings, you are going to define in the provider block. Now, what providers does? What providers does? Very, very important concept we need to understand here. What providers actually do? Each provider, each provider add a set of resources. Each provider will have set of resource types. Each provider will have a set of resource types and data sources that Terraform can manage. Each provider will have set of resource types. Suppose if I am using AWS provider, something like this. Suppose if I am using AWS provider, something like this. Just to understand, I am saying something like this. Each provider will add set of resource types. Each provider will have set of resource types. Can I consider AWS EC2 this instance as a resource, AWS VPC as a resource type in that provider which we can create? Yes. So each provider will have set of resource types and a set of data sources. That Terraform can manage with the help of provider. Each resource type is implemented by provider. Each resource type is implemented by provider. Without providers, Terraform can't manage any type of resources. Each resource type is implemented by provider. Without providers, Terraform can't manage any kind of infrastructure. Suppose you want to create a EC2 instance. Do you need to use AWS provider? Suppose you want to terminate or you want to update EC2 instance via Terraform. Do you need to use AWS provider? Yes. Suppose you want to create a AWS VPC. Suppose you want to create a AWS EKS cluster. Suppose you want to manage S3 buckets using Terraform. Without AWS provider, will you able to manage those AWS resource types via Terraform? No. So provider is like a APIs in the background. Providers are like a APIs, kind of a plugins in the background. So each provider will have set of resource types and data sources that Terraform can manage. Each resource type is implemented by a provider. Without providers, Terraform can't manage any kind of infrastructure resource. And what resource types are provided by what providers, you can see in the official documentation. So resources are most important elements in Terraform language. Resource is most important element in Terraform language. Each resource block describe one or more infrastructure objects such as virtual machines, virtual networks, compute instances, like that. So if you want to create any type of resource, if you want to create or manage any type of resource, you need to use appropriate provider. Where providers come from where providers are coming for Terraform to use. So providers are distributed separately from Terraform itself. Providers are distributed separately from Terraform itself. Each provider has its own release and version numbers. Each provider has its own release and version numbers. So there is a registry concept, guys. There is a registry. I hope you can understand registry concept. In general, if you are from a DevOps background, what is registry, guys? What is registry? Registry is different, repositories is different. So registry, it's kind of a central storage to maintain some kind of artifacts, some kind of a packages. Registry is kind of a central storage where we can maintain some kind of artifacts, some kind of a packages. So it's a central storage where you can have some packages, some artifacts. Can we consider these providers also kind of artifacts, some kind of a packages for Terraform to work with various platforms? Yes. So these providers, the providers are maintained, the providers are distributed, the providers are distributed separately from Terraform itself, and there is a Terraform registry. There is a Terraform registry. So this is a public registry again, Terraform registry. This is a public registry. I have given the links also here. So this is a public registry, Terraform registry. It's a public registry. So Terraform registry is the main directory of a publicly available Terraform providers and other providers, host providers from most of the infrastructure platforms. So if you see, this is the link. This is a public Terraform registry. This is a public Terraform registry. I have provided the link. So in this registry, do you have a various providers for various platforms? AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Alibaba Cloud, Oracle Cloud, like this, various providers to manage various types of resources in various platforms like this. Yes. So providers are coming from Terraform itself. Providers are distributed separately from Terraform itself, and each provider has its own release and version numbers. The Terraform registry is a publicly available registry where there are providers, and each provider has its own documentation. Each provider has its own documentation, what type of resources can be created and managed using that provider, and what are the arguments for each resource type from that provider. This is very, very important, guys, because you want to create a EC2 instance using Terraform. Is it possible for me to remember and understand what options or arguments this will take? Suppose you are writing a Terraform code for creating an instance. Suppose you are giving like this. Is it easy for you to remember what arguments or what options I can use here? It is not very easy, right? You can't by heart also. You should not able to remember each and everything. It may take 100 different arguments like AMI, instance type, right? Security group, like that. Various arguments will be taken by each provider, each resource type. These arguments are going to be vary based on the resource type which you are creating from that provider. So it is very difficult to remember, and first of all, you should no need to remember all these things. There is a detailed documentation. Each provider has its own documentation describing what type of resources we can manage, and what are the arguments for each resource type in that provider. There is a detailed documentation. So the Terraform registry includes a documentation of wide range of providers, developed by HashiCorp or third-party vendors or Terraform community. You can use the documentation link. You can use the documentation link in a provider's header to browse its documentation. Just to give an example, I want to know more details about AWS provider and its resource types and its arguments. I want to know more details about AWS provider and what type of resources can be created and managed using this provider in AWS, and what are the arguments for each resource type. I can check in this documentation. I can go to this provider. If you see the version, what version of the provider, and there is a documentation. If I go to documentation here for AWS provider, they are giving more details. What is AWS provider? If you want to use this AWS provider, how to inform your Terraform to download this provider and use something like this. And here in the right hand side, all these things are resource types. Can be created and managed using this AWS provider in AWS. Suppose if you see, I want to create AWS EC2 instance. I want to create AWS EC2 instance. Do you have something called EC2 here? The resource type, what type of resources can be managed using this provider? They are giving all the details. Suppose I want to know this resource type and how to use this resource type. I can click on this one, click on this one, click on this one. It will give more details. It will give more details. So resource AWS AMI. If you want to create a AMI and its attributes. Suppose you want to create an instance, AWS underscore instance, that is like a server. Suppose you want to create an instance. Now we'll be able to understand how to create AWS instance via that provider, like what arguments to pass, like this. And there is a detailed documentation, arguments, like AMI, right? In which availability zone you want to create that instance. Suppose instance type, what type of instance you need to create, instance type, what key pair you want to use, right? Under which subnet I need to create. So do you have all these things as an options or arguments? Like suppose you want to set the tags, you want to give the subnet ID, under which subnet you want to create that instance, the tags. So these are arguments for that resource type. Suppose you want to create some kind of a S3 bucket using Terraform. So in AWS provider, these are resource types. These are resource type. These are resource types. Suppose you want to create S3 bucket, there is something called S3. There is something called S3. So if you expand this one, within S3 there are various types. So suppose you want to create a S3 bucket, this is resource type. Suppose you want to create a S3 bucket policy, bucket ACL, different resource types are there. Suppose you want to create a S3 bucket, can you write some code like this? AWS resource, AWS S3 bucket, your bucket name, your tags for bucket, like that, and various other arguments for that resource type. Various other arguments for that resource type. You can see arguments references. So you no need to by heart, you no need to hard code anything, you no need to by heart anything. So based on your requirement, can you browse the provider documentation which you are using, and can you able to understand what type of resources that provider will support to create or update, and what are the arguments for that provider, that resource types will be able to understand by looking at this documentation. Yes, guys, understand Terraform is a code, infrastructure as a code. So if you know the concept, what is Terraform, what is provider block, what is Terraform block, what is resource block, if you know the concept, writing a Terraform code becomes easy for you. So is everyone clear? First of all, what is provider, what providers do, from where providers are coming, where is the documentation? Is everyone clear on this one? Sir, we have mentioned provider in Terraform block also. Once again, we are doing provider block. I told, right? So this is like you are informing Terraform. You are informing Terraform that I need AWS provider. But are we configuring that provider? Like in what region? In what region you want to manage the resources? What is the role Terraform can use to talk to the AWS provider? What is the access key or secret key that Terraform can use to talk to the AWS provider? Are we defining those details here? I already told here. So that's what I told already. So here you are just telling AWS Terraform that download this provider. But here are we configuring that provider, like under which region, under which what access key or secret key you need that Terraform can use to talk to that provider, like that? Provider related settings. provider related settings you are defining in the provider block. Terraform related settings you are setting in the Terraform block. I hope you can clear now. Terraform related settings you are setting in the Terraform block. Provider related settings you are setting in the provider block. But in the Terraform block, you are just telling Terraform that I need this provider. That's it. So from where Terraform will download this provider, we have given source like this. We have given source like this. HashiCorp/AWS. This is Terraform registry. From Terraform registry, it is going to download this provider. So this is Terraform related configurations. This is provider related configurations. Clear? Now, and again, if you guys are using old version of Terraform, there is no Terraform block earlier. There is no Terraform block. This is how we used to define in the older versions of the Terraform. But now latest version is 1.x. So most of the Terraform code you see something like this only. Now, what providers do, from where providers are coming, where is the documentation of the provider? This is very, very important. So is everyone clear? What is providers do, from where providers are coming, from where providers are being downloaded by Terraform, and where is the documentation, how to use the Terraform providers, and what type of resources that provider is supporting, and what are the arguments. If you want to see all those details, there is a documentation in the Terraform registry. Suppose you are working with Azure platform, you can go and select it, and you can go to the documentation. So this is how you are going to tell Terraform. That I want to work with Azure provider, Azure cloud, and you are going to set Azure related configurations here. Now, in the right hand side here, all these are resource types, Azure resource types that can be created or updated or managed via Terraform. Suppose in Azure, you want to create a compute instances. In Azure, you want to create a compute instances that we call it as Azure virtual machines like that. Azure virtual machines like that. Suppose you want to create a network, VNet, Azure VNet we call it. So these are the types of resources. Suppose you want to create a Azure load balancers, The way you have a AWS ELB, in Azure we have Azure load balancer. So you are going to say something like this. Azure load balancer, this is the load balancer name. Azure has a different concepts, resource groups, subscriptions, all these details you need to pass. So if you know what is Azure, how it works, using this Terraform, using Azure provider, using these resource types, will I able to manage resources in Azure also? Whether it's a load balancer, whether it's a AKS cluster, whether it's a Azure virtual machine or Azure storage, whatever it is, supported by all these things here. If you see, if you want to create machine in Azure cloud, you are going to use this type of resource, Azure virtual machine. What type of machine it is, like this. So it is very difficult to remember all these types of resources and its arguments like this. But if you know what is provider block, what is Terraform block, what is provider, what is resource, if you know, by looking at the documentation itself, will be able to define your infrastructure resources in any provider using that provider and its resource types and its arguments. Yes. So guys, use the documentation widely. Here when you guys are working with Terraform. Again, how to find the providers? How to find the providers? So how to find the providers? That is based on your usage. To find the provider for the infrastructure platforms you use, you can go and find the providers in the registry. Suppose you want to manage your infrastructure resources in AWS. So can I go and find whether there is a provider using that? We can create and manage the resources in AWS like that? Yes. So in the Terraform registry, you have various providers. In the Terraform registry, you have various providers. All these things are various providers. Thousands, over 1,000+ providers are there to manage the resources in various providers, various platforms. Some providers on the registry, are developed and published by HashiCorp only. Some providers on the registry are developed and published by HashiCorp only. Some providers, are published by the platform maintainers, like a community people. And some providers are published by some kind of a users, voluntaries, right? So the provider listings will have the badges also. The providers, whatever is listed in the registry, have a badges. Badges indicates who develop and who maintain that provider. Each provider will has a badge. Whatever providers you see here, each provider has some kind of a badge. If I go to AWS, do you see, is it saying like some badge, official, some badge? Each and every provider which is there in the Terraform registry has a badges. Can you see something like official for all these providers, like Azure provider, Google provider? Do you have some kind of a badge, official? Yes. So each and every provider available in the Terraform registry have a badges. The provider listings use the badges to indicate who developed and who maintained that provider. So something like this. If you see official provider, you see some badge like this, official. Any provider you see like this, official. So any provider where there is a badge called official, who is maintaining and who is managing that providers? You can see here itself. Any badge, there is something called official. Who is owning that providers? Who is managing that providers? You can see here itself. HashiCorp only. HashiCorp only. So HashiCorp only. When you guys are using official providers, you are saying in your Terraform code, you are saying the source. The source is HashiCorp, because that is owned by HashiCorp and they are maintaining in the official registry in this space. That's why you are saying HashiCorp/AWS. So any provider managed by any provider owned and managed by HashiCorp only. So that provider is available in the Terraform registry in this space. You can consider this as kind of a repository. In this repository, they have this provider like that. So you are specifying something like this. And we have some providers, partnering providers, third-party organization, third-party company. Partner providers. The partner providers are written and maintained and validated and published by third-party companies only against their own APIs. So partner providers are written, managed, validated, published by third-party companies only against their own APIs they have developed that providers. So who is owning these partner providers? Who is maintaining, who is developing, and who is maintaining those providers in the Terraform registry? Third-party companies only. Example, you can see filters. You can filter here also. When you go to Terraform registry, you can see the filters. Official, partner. Suppose let me remove this partner checkbox. Let me remove this community checkbox and let me remove partner checkbox. If you see, these are the providers managed by Terraform. Terraform only have owned this AWS provider, Azure provider, Google provider, Kubernetes provider, all these providers like Vault, Salesforce, Oracle Public Cloud, Console, all these providers are developed and owned by Terraform only. And we have something called partner providers. Let me unselect this. Let me select partner providers. Now we have something like this Alibaba Cloud. Is this provider developed, validated, tested, maintained by Terraform? This Alibaba Cloud, this provider, you can still use. You can still use this Alibaba Cloud provider to manage the resources in Alibaba Cloud. But is this provider is developed by, owned by HashiCorp? No, like a partnering, right? So you can still use this Alibaba Cloud provider. You can say provider Ali Cloud and under which region. So using this provider, if required, can you work with Alibaba Cloud to create resources in Alibaba Cloud the way you are creating in AWS Cloud or Azure Cloud, GCP Cloud? Yes. So, but this is developed by partners. This is developed by partnering companies. You have all these things. You have all these things. Suppose all these things are like a partnering providers. Various providers are there. You can see something like this. MongoDB Atlas, like a Mongo database cloud, right? So if you want to work with Mongo database cloud, you can use this provider and you can create resources. You can create resources in this like this. Similarly, there are a lot of partnering providers. They are made it available in the Terraform registry for Terraform users to use. Now, similarly, we have community. Community providers are published to the Terraform registry by individual maintainers or group of maintainers or other members of the Terraform community. So you can also become a community member. You can also develop some provider to manage some resources in some platform, and you can also develop some providers. You can also become a member, community member in Terraform. You can maintain your own providers also to manage some resources in some platforms. Something like this. You can filter with these community providers. Like some companies or some people, individual persons or group of person also can develop and maintain some providers. All these things are like a community providers. But most widely you will be using official providers and partnering providers. Official providers and partnering providers. So is everyone clear? First of all, what is provider, from where providers are coming, and what do you mean by official provider, what do you mean by partnering provider, what do you mean by community provider? And archived is like a archived providers that are officially or partner providers that are no longer maintained. Suppose you have some archived providers, in the sense deprecated ones. Is it recommended to use archived providers again? Archived in the sense they are no longer maintained by HashiCorp or the community also. So this is like they are deprecated. So it is not recommended to use archived providers. Archived in the sense deprecated ones. Old versions are deprecated ones. Clear? Very, very important concept, this provider. The whole Terraform concepts is relied on this providers concept, plugins concept. Using any provider which you have, using that providers, you can manage the resources in that providers. Any questions, any doubt, any confusion? What is provider block and what is providers? From where providers are coming? Any questions, any doubts, guys? Very, very important concept. So far, we discussed only two things. We discussed only Terraform block and provider block, and we will understand other blocks. What is resource block? We will understand other blocks. We have few more blocks: resource block, variable block, data source block, right? Output block, locals block, like that various blocks are there. We just discussed only two things. One is provider block and Terraform block. Now let's understand what is resource block. So resource block, the most important element of the Terraform language. The most important element of the Terraform language is resource block. You are defining your resource information, what resources you want to manage, using this resource block. The most important element of the Terraform language is resources. Each resource block describes one or more infrastructure objects. Each resource block describes one or more infrastructure objects such as virtual networks, compute instances, databases, buckets, managed Kubernetes clusters, so on. So whatever resource you want to manage using Terraform, whatever resources you want to manage using Terraform, you are going to define that information using resource block. So each resource block describes one or more infrastructure objects, infrastructure resources like machines, networks, load balancers, S3 buckets, managed Kubernetes clusters, IAM users, IAM policies, so on. This block is the backbone of any Terraform configuration. This resource block is the backbone of any Terraform configuration because it represents the actual resources. It represents the actual resources with the majority of other block types supporting role. They are going to play a kind of a supporting role to these resource blocks. So this is the backbone of Terraform configuration, this resource block. It represents your actual resources, and whatever other blocks we are using in Terraform code, they are going to play kind of a supporting role to this resource block. So the general syntax of the resource block something like this: resource, what type of provider, the provider, and the resource type in that provider, some kind of a local name, kind of a referencing name for that resource, kind of a resource name, local name for that provider. And resource block will have something like this: the provider underscore resource type and a name, kind of a resource name in the Terraform for that resource. And this configurations is like your arguments. This configuration is like arguments or body for that resource. If you see this example, now I decided I want to manage infrastructure using AWS. I want to manage resources in AWS provider. You are going to write a code like this. You inform Terraform, I need AWS provider. You configure your provider settings. Then you want to create AWS instance, right? So this is how you are going to write a code. Resource, provider. What is the provider? What provider we are using here in the Terraform configuration? AWS. And provider underscore resource type. So what type of resource it is? What type of resources you want to create under that one instance? So in AWS provider, do you have that type of resource? If you go to providers, AWS provider, if you go to the documentation, here if you expand under EC2, if you expand, do you see something called AWS underscore instance? So is AWS provider, using AWS provider, can I manage this type of resource? AWS provider underscore instance, which means using this resource type, can I create an instance or update the instance or terminate the instance like that? So how to use? They're giving something like this: resource AWS underscore instance. This is like a label we discussed, right? Block. This is like a resource block. block is a kind of a container for some content. So using this resource block, are we defining some information, some configuration about what needs to be created, our desired state like that? Yes. So we are saying resource, this is block, resource block, provider underscore resource type, AWS instance. And this is like what? Second one, this is like a name. This is like a name. This one is like a name. This name is like a identifier. This name is the identifier we can use throughout the Terraform code to refer this resource. Suppose this resource, whatever resource I am creating here, this resource I need to refer in some other location in the Terraform configuration, I can use this name. So this is like a label or name, Terraform resource name. This is the name. Name is the identifier which we can use throughout the Terraform code to refer this course to this resource. The provider above is the name of the provider, that is AWS. Type is the type of resource. Type is the type of resource to create in that provider. This is resource type. Type is the type of resource to create in that provider. Example, instance, which represents EC2 instance. The name, this name, whatever I am giving here, this is like a identifier we can use throughout the Terraform configurations to refer this resource. And this config is like a arguments. This config is like arguments, one or more arguments that are specific to that resource. Guys, again, is all the resources whatever you are creating, is this arguments remain same? Suppose you are creating some other resource, let's say you are creating something like this. Is this arguments remain same for any resource, any provider which you are using? No. Arguments are going to vary. Arguments are going to vary based on the provider, based on the resource type, based on the provider, based on the resource type also. Suppose you are trying to create Azure. So you said Azure provider like this. But is this arguments for this provider block? Is this arguments for Azure resources remain same again? Is this arguments for provider block? Is this arguments for Azure type? And is this remain same? If you guys are using Azure, is this resource type? Is this arguments remain same like that? No. Where you can find those details? What type of resources can be managed using that provider? What are the arguments for each resource type? Where you can find all those details? This is very, very important point to remember. Where you can find what type of resources can be managed using that provider, and what are the arguments for each resource type, the configurations for each resource type, where you can find. Just 10 minutes ago only I discussed. In the documentation, in the providers documentation, So where is that providers documentation? From where providers are coming? Where is the provider documentation? Just 5 minutes ago only discussed. Where providers are coming? Where is that provider documentation? What type of resources the provider is supporting? What are the arguments? That is in the Terraform registry. So I want you to focus on the concepts, guys. What is provider block? What is Terraform block? What is resource block? If you know the concept of these Terraform code configurations, will you able to write an infrastructure as a code using Terraform for any provider, for any type of resource, using the documentation itself? If you know what is HCL, if you know what is variables, what is resource block, what is providers block, what is data source block, like that, if you guys know, will you able to write any type of infrastructure as a code in any platform by referring the documentation? That is what my question. Yes. You can do that. So that's why I told in the demo itself. So if you know the Terraform concepts, you can use Terraform to provision or manage any type of infrastructure using Terraform infrastructure as a code. But the providers, the resource types and its arguments will change. That's it. But the Terraform concept remains same. Clear? What is resource block? Is everyone clear? But if you know only Terraform, that is not sufficient. If you know only Terraform, that is not sufficient, because you need to know the cloud, that respective cloud also. Because without knowing Azure cloud, do you know what is what in the arguments? You don't know what is resource group in Azure. You don't know what is subscription in Azure. You don't know what is service, what services are there in Azure. If you know only Terraform again, if without having Azure cloud knowledge, is it again easy for you to define everything in a code, Terraform code? No. So you need to be comfortable with that cloud platform, so that you can understand. Since you guys are familiar with AWS cloud, now even though I am defining something like this, will you guys able to understand what do you mean by AMI, what do you mean by instance type? I think you can relate all these things, right? AMI, instance type, VPC, S3, yes. So you are just providing your infrastructure as a code, but in the background, we discussed the architecture. In the background. What Terraform is doing is Terraform is invoking APIs via those providers. Yesterday we discussed, right? Terraform core. Terraform core will take two things as input: your Terraform scripts, that is Terraform configurations, and Terraform state, and it will compare the current state with the help of state file, and the desired state is your configuration. If there is any difference in the current state, that is Terraform state, and desired state, that is your script, what Terraform core will do, using those providers, it will communicate with that respective platforms to update or destroy or delete or create. That is what Terraform is doing. So Terraform concept remains same, but only the providers, its options, its resource types will change. So here we are giving resource type as AWS underscore instance. This is like a name, and these are like arguments for that resource. For instance, in the above example, AWS underscore instance resource has many different arguments. But for now, we are only setting whatever it is required, like a kind of a mandatory. So we are saying AMI. What is the AMI needs to be used for Terraform to create that instance, and again what type of instance it has to be created. But there are various other arguments. If you want to know what are the arguments for this resource type in that provider, you can go to Terraform registry, you go to AWS provider, you go to browse providers, select this provider, go to documentation. Here you search like this also, AWS underscore instance also you can search. AWS underscore instance also, something like this you can search. So this is resource block, and they are saying examples with the arguments list also they are giving. Arguments list, AMI, and there are various other arguments also, like key name, key pair, what key pair has to be used, and subnet ID, what under which subnet it has to be created, under which availability zone it has to be created, like that. So these arguments are specific to that resource type. What you use here, that is specific to this resource type. I hope you are clear. What you use here, that is specific to this resource type. So most of the arguments within the body of the resource block is specific to that selected resource type. Every Terraform provider has its own documentation. Every Terraform provider has its own documentation describing its resource types and their arguments. So you can go and check in the argument something like this. Suppose you want to create S3. There is something called AWS S3 bucket. AWS S3 bucket resource. AWS S3 bucket or AWS bucket like that. You have something like this. You go to resources. You go to resources, or let me clear this. Let me go to resources. You have S3. Let me scroll down. S3, right? You expand this one, AWS underscore S3 underscore bucket. Suppose if I have to create a S3 bucket, I can specify something like this. I can specify something like this with some arguments. But these arguments are specific to this resource type. What type of arguments you can use here? You can see the documentation here. You can see the documentation here, right? Bucket prefix, whether you want to enable versioning, whether you want to enable make public, whether you want to enable versioning, whether you want to create a bucket policies, lifecycle rules. Like this, they have given some samples. If you see their S3 bucket, they are giving a some kind of a bucket name, access control list, versioning is enabled, replication rules. Can I consider this as a nested blocks within the resource block now? Can I consider this as a nested block within the resource block? This is like a top level blocks. These are like a nested blocks. These nested blocks are again specific to these resource types. So is everyone clear? What is resource block? This is the backbone of Terraform configuration. This resource block is a backbone of Terraform configuration. So the most important element of the Terraform language is resource block. Each resource block describes one or more infrastructure resources such as virtual machine, networks, compute instances, data sources, buckets, all those things. Block type, this block type, resource block type is a backbone of any Terraform configuration. It represents actual resources and many other blocks which we are using in Terraform is like playing a supporting role to this resource block. Is everyone clear what is resource block? Any doubt, any confusion here? Resource block. So far we discussed three important. One is Terraform block. This is Terraform related configurations and settings. Provider block, provider related configurations and settings. This resource block, using resource block, you are defining your resources, what resources you want to manage using Terraform. Clear? These three blocks, whatever has been discussed so far. Now we have some other blocks. Variable block. In detail, we will discuss about variable block. There are three blocks within variables and outputs. Variable block, output block, local block. These are very, very important. Can we define multiple resources under one resource block? Multiple resources of different types? Understand logically, Akbar. Understand logically. Multiple resources of different types you are asking? Can we define? Guys, how come it is possible? How come it is possible? If I define like this, does that provider can understand? This is logically doesn't make any sense, right? Suppose you are saying, sir, can I define like this? You are asking something like this. Does that provider will able to understand this? This is considered as a arguments for this resource type. This also will be considered as a argument for this resource type. Does that APIs can understand these as an argument for this resource type if you keep like this? Just logically think. Logically think. Under this resource, using resource, I am defining this resource type. I am providing these details. These arguments is valid for this resource type. Is this is also considered as an arguments for this resource type? Is Terraform APIs that providers will be able to understand what you are passing here? No. But same type, let's say same type, can I say, suppose I need 10 servers. Can I use something like this? Yes, this is possible. So if I say count as 10, which means how many instances will be created, how many AWS instances will be created using these configurations? 10. So multiple resources of same type is possible like this, but two different resource types under one block, that is not possible. And you can define n number of blocks, n number of resource blocks. You can define n number of resource block in a single Terraform file also. You can define 1,000 resource blocks also in a single Terraform. Suppose I want to create a VPC. Can I do something like this? Something like this. CIDR. I hope you can understand this CIDR. So can I define something like this in same Terraform file? Resource type. Is this resource type can understand what parameters you are giving here? Like this? Yes. Think logically, you have all the answers for you. And how many resources you want to create? Can I define 100 different resources with different configurations? Suppose I want to create a subnets. Can I do something like this also? We will discuss all these things. How to do all these things we will discuss, guys. I am going to demonstrate, but understand the blocks. What is provider block? What is resource block? What is what? Understand that concept. Practically, we will create EC2 instance. We will create a VPC, subnets, route tables, NAT instances. All those things we will discuss. But focus on the basics of HCL, HashiCorp language, the Terraform configuration language. But without knowing what is this, if you guys copy paste, or if you guys by heart line by line, that is not going to work out. You should not by heart anything. You should not by heart makki you should not write. So understand what is Terraform block, what is provider block, what is resource block, what is resource type, what is resource configurations. Understand that one so that you can become expert in the Terraform also. Clear? Now let's understand other blocks. You have various other blocks like variable block. We have a lot of other blocks, right? Like a variable block, local block, output block, like that. These two are like input variables. This is like output. You want to capture some output, you can display that output. So variables plays very important role in any configuration code, right? Suppose you guys are using Jenkins, you guys use Ansible. Is variable play very important role? Instead of hard coding something in your configurations, can we reuse the same code by passing different variables to that configurations like that? Yes. Same concept here. In detail, we will discuss all these things. I am just giving a introduction about blocks. What is variable block, what is output block, how to use all these blocks, we will discuss in detail. This is just a beginning only. So variables in Terraform are an excellent way to define your resources, manage your resources. So variables in Terraform are an excellent way to define centrally managed and reusable values. Information contained in the Terraform variables is stored independently of your deployment plans. So Terraform supports multiple variable formats based on their usage. Input variables using variable block. Using variables block, you can define variables, and you can use these variables in your resource blocks. You can use these variables in your resource blocks. You can use these variables in your parameter, that provider block. You can use these variables in the Terraform block, like that. So instead of hard coding, just to give an example, instead of hard coding like this, in some time I may need to create t2.micro. Instead of hard coding like this, you can define this as a variable. We will discuss all these things, guys. We can define this as a variable. AWS, I mean to say Terraform variable. So you can say variable something like this, variable something like this, instance type. What type of variable it is? You can say string, and a default value. You can say default value also. Just to give an example, default value, something like this, something like this, default value, something like this. And these variables you can refer in your configurations, something like this, interpolation, like var dot instance type, like this. Now, when I am applying also, at runtime, I can pass differently. Terraform apply, right? Terraform apply hyphen var instance type is a t2.medium, something like this. So is it giving much more flexibility to manage our infrastructure resources? Now, if I apply like this, now instead of t2.micro, what type of instance will be created? If I am referring something like this at runtime, I am passing something like this, t2.medium. So variables, this variable block, we have variable block, output block, local block, like that. Variables and outputs. Variables in a Terraform is an excellent way to define centrally managed reusable values. Information contained in Terraform variables are stored independently of your whatever way you are deploying. Terraform supports multiple variable formats based on their usage. The variables are generally divided into three things: input variables, output variables, local variables. These input variables you can define using variable block. They will serve as a parameters to Terraform modules or Terraform configurations, allowing users to modify the behavior without editing the code. So without editing this code, can I pass different values to my Terraform configurations without editing the code? Now, sometimes I want to create t2.xlarge. Can I pass something like this also? Yes. So you have a input variables using variable block you can define, and output values. These serves as a return values for a Terraform module. Suppose Terraform is creating something and Terraform is returning something. I can capture that into a output variable using output block. And there is something called local variables, local values. So we will discuss in details about all these block again later: variable block, output block, local block. These are like a variables and outputs for your Terraform configurations. These three blocks again we will discuss in detail: how to define a variables, what do you mean by variable block, what type of variables Terraform supports, like a string, numbers, boolean, map, list, output variables, local variables. We will discuss all these things in a separate session. So is everyone clear? Whatever has been discussed so far, the HCL configurations, the HCL code, till here we discussed. But this is just an introduction, guys. But did I created any resource as of now? Did I used any variables or local variables or output variables as of now? No. This is just an introduction of HCL. So what is HCL? What is block? What is resource block, Terraform block, provider block, variable block? Like this we discussed. So these two blocks I'll continue tomorrow. Once we are familiar with these HCL configurations, then only we will start actual Terraform. We will install Terraform. we'll start using all these blocks to define and manage our resources. So from here, I'll continue tomorrow. Module block, that data block. Someone was asking what is data source. We will discuss that data block, module block, and the file extensions and directory structures. File extensions and directory structures, the Terraform workflow, all these things we will discuss tomorrow. Once we are familiar with this HCL and Terraform flow, then we will install Terraform and we will start creating the resources. Any questions, any confusions here? From here, I'll continue tomorrow, guys. This module block, data block or data source block, I'll continue tomorrow. If no questions, thank you. That's it for today. Tomorrow we'll continue from here. Labs, labs I will start maybe day after tomorrow only. But before lab, right? Before we set up Terraform, before we work with Terraform, you need to be comfortable with Terraform concepts. What is Terraform? What are the advantages with Terraform? What do you mean by HCL, HashiCorp language? What is what is resource block, provider block? All these things you should be familiar before we start the labs. So this maybe tomorrow also we will be discussing about theory only. Then we will install Terraform. Maybe Friday we will start some basic Terraform lab. Slowly we will understand complex scenarios in the Terraform. Okay? But these basics are very important, guys. Without understanding all these concepts again, if you directly jump into the lab, if you directly started writing the code, you may not able to understand what is what. So that's why I recommend go through these documents, go through these recordings one more time before we start into the labs. Okay. Thank you, guys. That's it for today. I'll continue tomorrow.